Всем добрый вечер. Мы продолжаем нашу серию воркшопов по PBL. Сегодня у нас среда, третий воркшоп из 5. Не забывайте, что в 5 часов у нас идет основной курс каждый день. Также у нас сегодня есть еще один воркшоп в 7 часов, извиняюсь, по Астане. Не пропустите нас. Динара и Джами будут делиться их опытом использования PBL, так же, как и вчера. Нет, Динара и Гульзадем, извиняюсь. Я хочу сразу извиниться заранее перед всеми участниками. Мне придется отлучиться ненадолго, но, надеюсь, до конца сессии я буду опять с вами. Наши переводчики работают в полном режиме, как говорится. Так что все ваши комментарии, все ваши вопросы, они будут также переводить. Поэтому не стесняйтесь, задавайте вопросы, пишите комментарии. И увидимся с вами немножко позже. Я передаю микрофон Джону. John, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this third session, and glad to have you here. Just again, just so you know that at any time, if you have questions, please post in the chat. You also have my email address here where you can also send questions afterwards if you are looking for some answers as you are developing and designing your projects. And just a reminder that this link will take you to the resource page for this series. It also includes tasks, steps that you are invited to take before each of these sessions. And it's a way to to give you a pathway to think about this more deeply, and also with the planning, because the PBL template that you're encouraged to use is also available there as well. So I'll bring this slide again at the end of the session, and maybe someone can actually put this into the chat for your convenience. We'll continue with that. So just to start us off, I'd like you to choose one of these two questions to answer in the chat. What is one important idea that you now have about PBL for students since starting this webinar series? Or what is one important question that you have about PBL for students? Let's keep in mind our norms for how we're going to support each other in our professional learning and growth. Everyone contributing deepens everyone's learning. So as you post in the chat, it's an opportunity for you to see each other's thoughts and ideas. For example, what's just been posted about one important thing about PBL is that you can do it cross-curriculum, and equally important, perhaps even more important, is the authentic learning, those real-world connections that we can immerse our students in deep experiences around. Pay attention to self and others. Again, if there's something you don't quite understand, please ask about that. Or if there's something you want to learn more about, ask about that. Just make sure that you're getting the information and understanding that you want by the time we finish the series. And listen intently with one's whole self. So both in terms of what I'm talking about, but also what you might see in the chat as other people are contributing their experience and expertise around the topic. So one of the things that yesterday we looked at was the 6 elements of high quality project-based learning. These are very important to be considered as part of your work. And when you are in that Google Doc that I shared a link with you, and you look at under foundational steps, you'll find that there is an article there, or actually under introduction, there's an article called Understanding the 6 Elements for a PBL Framework. Today, when we talk about call to action, it's about that first element, intellectual challenge and accomplishment, because this is the one that's all about what are your curriculum standards, your key skills and concepts that your students need to know. And then when you curate that challenge, problem, question, or issue, that is where we begin the call to action, which is what our focus is for today's session. And so this brings it all together when we are planning a project. In fact, when we plan a project, the first 3 elements, which we're going to be exploring, are the ones that go into the planning structure of your project. When you think about the curricular connections and what students are going to learn in an authentic way is going to be those first three elements. The second three elements, collaboration, project management, and reflection, are ones that we consider as we plan the experiences, the logistics, to ensure that the student experience is powerful and engaging. So that's a way of looking at these two sets of elements. We talked about, when you're coming up with a project idea, there's different places that you can find ideas. It could be from the community, current events, could be from your students. You may have a topic that you're very passionate about. And there's also a lot of project libraries. And I shared some links with you of libraries where you could explore projects that have been developed by other teachers. And if you go to that Google Doc page, I have a list of some of those libraries there for you, so that you can actually, explore that more deeply. So those are some options. And when you are identifying an audience, because that's what, it's going to engage your students into real world connections. This is a way of thinking about how to identify a good audience and basically a purpose for your project. It is to ask yourself the question, when students truly understand and master the concepts and skills, can they raise awareness? Can they entertain about it? Can they advocate about an issue to get other people involved? Or could they just solve a problem? And when you establish that focus, what that leads to is finding that target audience and how you can address their needs. So, and then this piece, this is something actually that's more of an advanced concept. This is really about how do we ensure that we have a deep, authentic experience for our students. And at the foundations, again, it's always your curriculum. What's your curriculum about? What do students need to, as level one, apply those content and skills in a related STEM field? And then the level two is, as they are, applying those skills, what is our authentic purpose that they could be working towards? And so that leads to this list of questions, which I'll bring back again at the end of our session with a fifth question. But these are really the first steps that you want to take when you are designing your project. When you design your PBL unit, you want to identify what are your curriculum standards, who can your students apply those skills to meet a need for, what's the authentic purpose or the call to action that students are going to address, which is what we're going to look at, and then what product or presentation will students provide that one of those final assessments that students will put together for their target audience. So when you're designing a project, these are the questions you're going to initially answer in order to flesh out the entire unit. So let's take a moment, and I'd like you, based upon what we just reviewed, what's new or important about a PBL idea that you want to spend more time using in instruction? And let's take 10 seconds to silently reflect, and then I'd like you to post in the chat box and see where your thinking is at this point. So 10 seconds begins now. Okay, when you're ready, go ahead and post your thoughts. What is a new or important PBL idea that you want to spend more time using in instruction based upon what we just reviewed? Okay, so our first question is, how do you use results after about a project in society? So it depends on the focus. So for example, let's say, the project is about, well, I mentioned before, like it was about the pandemic, about how best, like we're studying about cells or the spread of diseases, and we're exploring those type of things, or body chemistry. So we're connecting that to COVID or even the flu season. Oh, I understand it's not a question, but I'm gonna take it as a question because some people do have that question, but it's a good point. Then it's about, thinking about who's our audience. So if our audience is the public, we might want to just be informational and say, hey, here are some steps you can take. If it's the a ministry of health, maybe it's more about we want to suggest a plan for our event that would help promote the ideas of how to, stay safe and stay healthy. So we might make something that might be an infomercial at that point. So depending upon the audience, we'll shift how we use this, how students will use the information. But yeah, I appreciate it wasn't a question, but it is a question some people would have. So thank you for posting that. The use for yourself. When I think of the word yourself, I'm thinking about I'm going to think about the audience. So the first part for the teacher is we want to make sure that whatever skills the students are using is in your curriculum. This is what you're teaching. So if I'm teaching mathematics and I'm working on measurements and I'm working on shapes, that can lead to architecture in a couple different ways. It could be about architecture appreciation, if this is like social studies, and we're studying different architects and looking at what they've created, and then we're going to connect shapes and measurements to that. It could be about designing. For example, I don't know if you have this in Kazakhstan, but there's a movement in the US and in Europe about what's called a tiny house. So a tiny house is basically a small 10 by 10 house that is built so that people who can't afford housing will have a place that they can stay, a shelter. And so there are students who will design these 10 by 10, I guess it's 3 meters by 3 meters, house homes that they will either then build or they will propose that local communities would build. And they'll suggest like locations in the city or in the country where they could be placed so that people would have some housing, whether it's temporary or permanent. So that's the example. There are others who are designing bigger houses, houses that you would see that your developers would want to build, and they'll create blueprints. So they're working on scale, model, and measurements. So there's a lot of different ways that could work. Let's see. No, we're talking about the practical benefits of the results of the project completed by students for your school, region, etc. Okay, so let me look at this. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. We're talking about the practical benefits. So when you say practical benefits, are you saying practical benefits for academics or practical benefits for your community? Because both apply, but it depends on where you're looking at. So for practical benefits, are we community? Okay. So yeah, so again, it depends upon what is your focus for community need. And the thing is, you can come up with any focus. I mean, you look at your community and say, what's going on here? And the reason I keep coming up the pandemic, and I'll change the topic, is that's a big issue where I live. And you have to look at issues where you live. Like one issue that maybe you share is that businesses are struggling right now because most people are staying at home, or they can only be open for limited hours. They can't have people inside the restaurants. So restaurants that haven't figured out how to do delivery or to do carry out outside of their building are really struggling. So if I'm teaching English class, I can have students come up with a marketing or advertising campaign. So we're working on informational writing or persuasive writing, and they will work with a restaurant or a business. There was a middle school that I worked with where that's exactly what they're thinking about, because their community, and this was before COVID, their community was not financially well. Economically, it was a very poor community. And they had a couple of businesses there that really struggled to get people to come to their businesses. So this group of this 6th grade class did created a whole marketing campaign where they met with each class met with one business. So there's like 6 businesses in total, local business that met with the class and shared what their needs were. And then the students came up with a marketing plan that tied into their math and their English. So the students got that curriculum, and the businesses got a marketing plan that they could use, because what that plan had a focus on was how do we get, in this case, young adults to know about what these businesses had to share that was of value. Okay, we have one more. Let's do this one here, and then we'll continue. Yeah. So students actually can create the question, the topic, once they've had some experience in a PBL. But when you first start, then yes, the teacher would create the question. And we're going to go into in just a moment how you might create the question that you focus on. But yes, you absolutely, on the first day, introduce the question to the students. Actually, the first or second day, because you're going to do your call to action. In part is the question, and also it's your entry event. And so the entry event is how you launch the entire project, how you show interest to students. And so we'll get into that in just a moment. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. So call to action, that's what we're focusing on. So you start to build this project idea, and you have to think about how are you going to engage your students? How are they going to find value in what you're going to do? So these questions that talk about community and how you reach out to your community, once you've answered that question, that's what's going to engage your students. And now you have to introduce them to the community and the problem or challenge. And so these steps I shared with you before, we're looking at step 3, which is about developing an authentic purpose and including that call to action, which is going to be 2 things. It's going to be the driving question, and it's going to be your entry event, how you get things started. So when we think about call to action, like I say, it's a way to launch your project, and it's the way to show real world connection to the curriculum and the role that students are going to play in this process. So what you see in the box are different ways you can approach that. You can do a driving question. It could be a challenge statement, a challenge that you give them, they have to overcome. It could be inquiry-based. And I bring that up because sometimes teachers will say, I don't want to give the students the question at the beginning about what they're going to solve by the end, because I want them to discover that themselves. That would be inquiry-based. And so that is something that's very important. And, as you do your opening, which is your entry event, you want to think about, it could be a mystery question or a mystery statement, a riddle you want them to solve. There was a teacher in it was a chemistry class who did a CSI type approach. And if you don't know what CSI is about, solving crimes by doing autopsies or understanding the body system and trying to figure out from the science of the chemistries what was the cause of death. And so students came into the classroom, and there was a chalk outline of a body. It was a fake one. And there was a police officer there in the room, and a police officer said, I'm making you all officers of the law, and I'm charging you with solving this crime. And then that's how they started. That was their entry event. So as we think about this call to action, how are you going to start yours? One of the things that's important is thinking about is what's that opening question, that big idea question that you want students to answer. And so when we think about the big idea for the call to action, it should include 3 components. It should address the content. What is it students are learning about? Because you want to make sure by the end of the experience that they're not just having fun, but they're having fun and they're learning the content, the curriculum you want them to know. There's authentic purpose, so it's a real world connection to what they're doing. and then that content uncoverage that allows them to make sense of the information ideas you want them to know. And as we do that, we want to think about that the question or challenge should have these 4 elements. Should be open-ended. It should require content inquiry, where it leads to asking questions. It should engage students through a context so that they see how the abstract concepts relate to the real world focus. And then there should be some type of problem, need, or opportunity that students are going to solve for a target audience. So let's break this. Let's look at each of these separately. So what we do here is these are examples of driving questions. Some are better than others. And we're looking at from the lens of open-ended. And the idea of here open-ended, that it's one that requires, there's not one answer. Sometimes we say it's not Googleable. You can't put into Google to get the answer. If you do that, it's not an open-ended question. So for example, what is genetics would not be a good open-ended question, because you could put that in Google and solve it. So someone puts how and why questions, not what. Interesting. Yes. So I think she's looking at number 4. What are 3 challenges that we as scientists face when manipulating DNA? So that could be limiting in the way it's phrased, because it's basically, if it's implying that there's just 3 challenges and we're just getting the information. So the how and why questions are your best ones. You could do, there are places you can do what, it depends. Like in this case, if there are actually 20 challenges, then, what do we ask? We're asking to identify maybe the 3 best challenges, although that word best is not in this question. So I agree with the person who posted their comment that number 4 is probably not a good choice. Yes, see? I'm just reading your mind. You're saying it. I'm saying it as you were writing it. So you get credit because you were writing it. You were thinking it first. So we know that 1 and 4 are not probably the best answers. So that leaves us with 2 and 3. How can we as new species be genetically capable of survival? Or who are the important issues to be solved regarding the ethical use of genetics? So we look at those 2. The question is, which one would be better? So if you want to, before I change the screen and show you which one was actually used, go ahead and post which one you think was used. Which one do you think, number 2 or number 3? Which one do you think was the better driving question? If you could post in the chat the number 2 or the number 3, which that would represent which question you think would be the better answer, the better driving question. We have one brave person who's put an answer for number 2. Are there any others who want to take a guess? All right. So let's see which one was actually used by this teacher. And you can see that it was number 2. How can we as a new species be genetically capable of survival? So now let's see, no one, because are not for thinking development. Well, this one is we're just looking at the characteristic of open-ended. But if we're looking at a project about natural selection and within science, this actually is a pretty broad question that will challenge students with multiple pathways, which is something we want. We don't want them to look at the answer. We want to find out what the possible answers could be and then determine which is the best answer. So if I go back here, we look at 3. I mean, 3 had potential, but 2 is probably better. So in this case, so 3 is, who are important issues to be solved regarding the ethical use of genetics? And so the question is, once you find the important issues, because there could be, let's say there's 50 issues and you're trying to find 2. I mean, that's pretty in depth. The difference here, though, is the so what. They're both open-ended. They're both do a good job being open-ended. So both answers would be correct from an open-ended perspective. but 2 has that call to action. How can we as a new species be genetically capable of survival? So we're looking for that call to action is being capable of survival, finding that answer. Whereas number 3 is once you identify the important issues, you're done. It's over. All right, so let's move on to the next one. This one's about content inquiry, sustained inquiry, which means which of these questions does the best job in asking, encouraging students to ask questions. Now, if you find any that are tied, that are close to each other, then a tiebreaker is the one with that's better, a better open-ended question. So yes, good point. Question 3 is more of an essential question, which you definitely would use to guide students along the way, but would not be the big question, which number 2 would be the bigger question. Good point. All right, so looking at this, sustained inquiry, which one? So when we look at this, we're trying to say what creates more questioning. And so we have like, go ahead. Yeah, is there, oh, I guess if there's a way to do that in the background, because if we translate each of these, we won't get done within the 20 minutes I have left. Yeah. So when we look at this here, so the suggestion was 2 and 3 might be the best ones. So the first question, why is democracy in the U.S. a republic form of government? That is a pretty short answer. That's that Googleable. We can put that in Google and we can get the answer for that. How can we as citizens shape society's response to war? That could be a potential question to explore. Which amendments best demonstrate the rights of individuals? Now, that is a good question. The question is then that definitely would be for sustained inquiry. That definitely would support a lot of questions. The next step, though, we have to ask about that one is it open-ended enough? And the answer is probably not so much because, once you find the amendments, that's it. And then number 2, as senators, how can I shape policy for my home state? So the best answer is going to probably be number 2 and number 4. So let's see. Oh, okay. All right. Number 1 is a pretty short answer. You can just look it up and then you'd be done. It wouldn't ask a lot of questions. So let's look at what the teacher picked. How can we as citizens shape society's response to war? So that really opens up. It's very open-ended. It elicits a lot of questions. There's not one answer. Now, if you thought the answer should be 2, I would agree with you that could definitely be another potential one as well. All right. So, if it's close, then you're on the right track. That's the whole point of this experience right now is unpacking, understanding how we break these things apart. So engages students through context. So this means how does it do a job of connecting concepts and skills to a real world meaningful connection. So when you look at this, and again, anyone you think that is really close, then also identify, is it open-ended and does it have content inquiry, requires students to ask questions. So we have this first one, what's the hype about healthy eating? Or how can we as dietitians promote tasty, healthy lifestyle choices? Or what are 3 healthy food items can we choose to eat and promote? So number 3, we probably want to take that out right there, because once you identify the 3 foods, you're done. There's no in-depth questions for number 3. How can we use writing and nutrition knowledge to inform families about healthy eating choices? So of those 3 that remain, 1, 2, and 4, think about which one is better. So I see, number 4, someone just gave a vote for that one. And I would suggest that number 1 would be taken off the list, because what's the hype about healthy eating? While that's engaging, it may be too broad. It needs more clarity to be used. So that narrows us down to number 2 and number 4. So here's the interesting thing about 2 and 4. look at those two and think about which one you think is a better question. I love how people are being brave and just saying what they think it is, because that helps, think it through. 2 and 4 are your best choices, but 1 is the better choice by far. And we're going to look at which one the teacher ended up using. So you can see the teacher ended up using 2. How can we as dietitians promote tasty, healthy lifestyle choices? So why was that? What's the difference between 2 and 4? Well, the difference is, let's see, there's no food question because it's not a smart question. It doesn't follow the SMART analogy if you're talking about SMART statements. But the thing about 4 is number 4 is not written in student-friendly language. So if you thought number 4 had good context, you're right, it does. So that's not a trick answer. It's about us looking at the 2 best questions and saying, all right, now how do we decide which one's the better choice? If we took the problem with number 4 is that it focuses too much on the curriculum and not on the end in mind. So instead, if it said, how can we inform families about healthy eating choices, that would be a better question. Or how can we best inform families about eating choices? So we take out writing and nutrition knowledge because that's assumed. 3 is not so tricky as 4. 3 is decent. It's just that it says, what are 3 healthy food items can we choose to eat and promote? And it's like, okay, there's a lot of potential. With some revision to that, you're absolutely right. 3 could be a very good question. In this case, 2 is the question that the teacher picked, which is not the only answer. I agree with you. Those of you who thought 3 with some revisions or 4 with some revisions would be definitely good choices at that point, but they do require some revisions. So let's look at this next one. This is about how the question connects to a real world problem or opportunity or need. And again, as you look at this for that, if there's any that are ties, then whichever ones that fulfill the other elements we've already talked about will move forward. So one is, why does the impact of continued decline of pollinators exist in our community? Or how would using social media aid in explaining the problem of pollinators decline in our community? How can we reverse the decline of pollinators in our community? And should we care about the decline in pollinators? So one of those questions is an obvious no. It's not going to be a good question. And so the obvious no would be number 4. Should we care about the decline in pollinators? And the reason number 4 is because it's a yes/no question. All the students have to say is yes or no, and they're done. They don't have to continue with the project. I mean, it does relate to a real world issue, but it doesn't elicit any inquiry as a result of that. It's a closed-ended question. So that leaves us these other 3, and we have to decide which one would be the best one. So there's one more here that we can very quickly take off the list because it needs revision, and that's number 2. Yes, Tatiana gets credit because it was posted before I said it. And that's because look at the structure of the question, the sentence structure of the question. The focus is on social media. Well, if this is a tech class, that's fine. But if this is a science class, that's not going to work. We need, if anything, if we're going to use social media, we should say, how do we explain the problem of pollinator decline in our community through social media? So you put social media at the end, so the focus is on the problems of pollinators. So that one, number 2, we have to take off the list because it needs some revisions before we can use it. And so that leaves us with 1 and 3. Again, 1 is why does the impact of continued decline of pollinators exist in our community? And 3 is how can we reverse the decline of pollinators in our community? Wow. 2 good questions. And at this point, there's a nuance. I'm getting really picky. You may have heard the phrase splitting hairs. I'm getting really picky about there's one of these two questions that currently is structured better than the other. So think about that. Which one is better structured? The one, number 1 or number 3? And it's just by a little. Because you could use either question, but there's one that's probably better structured. So let's see which one the teachers picked. How can we reverse the decline of pollinators in our community? So if we look at that, that was number 3. That was that's the better one between 1 and 3. Now, could you use 1? Absolutely, you can use number 1. Here's the difference, and it's a really little difference, is that number 3, when you answer the question, you're asked to do something about it, which is, how can we reverse the decline? Number 1 is explaining the situation. So you identify the situation, but you don't do anything after that. You just say, here's the situation. All right, well, I'm done. Now, you could argue, well, wait a second, John, you talked before that our focus could be informing the community. If we're informing the community, could number 1 be the better driving question? Then the answer would be yes. 3, I think, is slightly better because students are asked to take an action. All right, good job. I love the way you guys are posting, engaging, because this is how you figure these things out. So again, these were the examples that we looked at of what would be considered good driving questions that fulfill the criteria. And it's what you want to think about when you are creating your own questions, is that you use these elements, these 4 criteria about designing a driving question that's open-ended, requires content inquiry, engages students through context, and relates to the real world need or opportunity. And then using the image, the call to action image with these 3 elements, authentic purpose, content uncoverage, and student context, are key to developing a good question. And you'll see in a reference here, there's some articles that you can read to go in more in depth. And these articles are listed in the Google Doc so that you can go back and review these ideas. So the other thing is, when we think about call to action, is one part is the driving question or challenge statement that we just looked at. Another part is going to be the entry event. Now, I'd have you reflect about what we just did, but I liked how you engaged in the chat. So we're going to skip this one. And we're going to talk about entry event, because you got to excite your kids, your students, on the first day about what this project is about and how it relates to what role they're going to play. So what we don't want to say is, hey, we're just going to learn about, in science, we're going to learn about cells. We're going to learn, vocabulary like mitosis, and we're going to spend time, doing worksheets and learning definitions. Well, that's not going to excite kids. But if instead you do what a 5th grade class did in one school, where the teacher said, hey, we're going to look for a cure for cancer. Wow. And that was in studying for cells. And that was their focus. They were jazzed. They were excited about the fact that they were going to have a voice. I've seen teenagers, when they didn't have a library in their community. So they built a mobile library, which was basically, they created a big box where they would put books in a box and they would park it in the community, and people could come up to it and take a book out to read. And then when they're done, they put it back, or they could swap out a book in place of the one that they gave so that other people could read books in the community. There's lots of different ways we can do that. And here are ways you can launch an event, your project. Maybe you start with a video. So you've noticed that each of these days during this series, we've watched a video, a hype video about the work that's going on, the support that's happening. That's one way. It could be a scenario, a role play. Like, so when I told you about how the police officer was waiting for students with the outline of a body in the classroom, that's a role play. Field trips. A lot of times field trips happen at the end of a unit. Why not start the unit with a field trip? A week, so students have done, go out and they are interviewing, like if they go field trip to a zoo, They're interviewing the people there to get information from experts immediately that they can take back in their studies of habitats for animals. You can give them a challenge, a puzzle. I mean, there's lots of ways. A powerful way is a guest speaker, to have someone through video conference talk to your students and say, I can't wait for you to help us solve this problem. Okay, so this says, I will use essential questions, and using their answer, I will recommend them to develop their research questions, develop their creativity skills, for example, to solve real. Yeah, that's a good approach, because you're empowering them to create their focus, their question. And that's awesome. That's definitely one way of doing this. So when you go into the resources I have for you, there's a couple of videos I have. So this one video, which talks about the U.S. Declaration of Independence, is being taught in a history English class. And the way it was introduced was this teachers did a role play where they told the students that they found a letter left on the floor by one of the students in the class that was breaking up with someone else. And they read the letter. And they talked, and the kids were excited and tense. And then the analogy between a breakup letter and how a country or colonies, wrote the Declaration of Independence to break up with Great Britain. This is a really cool video. It's one about, it shows slow motion actors sneezing, and you actually see the entire sneeze. So it gets pretty gross. Kids love it. And it's a great way to launch to talk about the spread of diseases. And in this case, the focus can be, how can we stop the spread of diseases? For example, not rubbing your eyes, not, touching your face with your hands, because they get to really see how a sneeze can really project, the phlegm that comes from a person. So check out this video. It's available for you to watch. So again, this is something to think about. How are you going to launch? And then when you do launch, then within that same day or the next day, you share your driving question or challenge statement, so students know this is what they're trying to accomplish by the end of the unit, the PBL unit. All right, these are the steps you want to think about and what you're producing. And like I said, you want that entry event that you're going to launch. That's the 5th part to this that's important. And if you go to this link, it will take you to the PBL template, as well as the resources and the readings that prepare you for tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at assessment fog. It's a very popular topic. People are really surprised when they start looking at their practice about what are they doing well and where might they make some changes to benefit their students. So I'm John McCarthy, and it's been a pleasure working with all of you, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you, John.